I'm happy to welcome people here to this session. Our session is titled, Can Trade Be Used to Promote Feminist Objectives, Evaluating Recent Innovations in Trade Policy? I'm Laura Macdonald, and I'm going to be chair of this panel. Sadly, we lost two panelists because of illness-related issues. So Erin, Hannah, and Alma Espino aren't able to participate today. So instead, we have three panelists. Tequila Brooks, Deborah Stienstra, and myself. I'll introduce each of us in order at the beginning, and then each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So, and we'll go in this order, Deborah, then Tequila, then me. I'd ask any audience members to remain muted. Well, all of us should remain muted when not speaking. And hopefully at the end, we can have people raise their hands if they want to ask a question, or you can type into the chat. So Deborah Stienstra, who's going first, holds the Jaroslavsky Chair in Families and Work at the University of Guelph, where she is the director of the Live, Work, Well Research Center and professor of political science. She is the author of About Canada, Disability Rights, and her research and publications explore the intersections of gender, disabilities, childhood, and Indigenousness. And Tequila Brooks is an attorney and comparative labor law scholar with 25 years of experience in the area of trade and labor policy. She previously served as the labor law advisor with the North American Commission on Labor Cooperation Secretariat, an institution created under the NAFTA labor side agreement. It'll be interesting if you have any comments about what's happening under USMCA with that. Tequila, she's co-author of the 2019 book, NAFTA and NALC, 25 Years of North American Trade Labor Linkage. That's the second edition of that text. And I'm Laura Macdonald. I'm a professor of political science and cross-listed to the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. I work on Latin American politics, North American integration, and gender and trade issues and other stuff. So welcome everybody. I look forward to speaking with you and looking forward to your insights on the intersections between gender, trade, and other forms of oppression. So with that, I'll pass it over to Deborah.
Thanks, Laura. And lovely to be here today. I wish we were in Boston. I wish I could be in person. I'm sure, as most of us, I am tired of this Zoom life. And that said, I should let you know that I don't multitask very well. So I'm sharing my screen and I'm going to be looking at my text. So I can't do chat at the same time as that. But I'm really looking forward to any questions and comments and discussions we might have together. So the project that I'm working on right now has been a long time in gestation, as you'll hear. And it's in part because of a reconnection with Laura that I'm sharing it with you today. And I'm really excited by the opportunity to bring it up to date and to think about the implications in the current context. So the title of my presentation is Seeking Greater Intersectionality in Trade, Learning from Women with Disabilities. And is my screen okay? You can see it? Good. So on the screen is an image that I've taken from the World Trade Organization, World Bank publication on gender and trade, and it's a group of women from their front cover. So my goal today is, or the overview of what I'm going to do today is to ask a couple of key questions, identify a couple of key questions, talk a little bit about gender-based analysis and trade in Canada in that context, talk about why we should think about women with disabilities and trade and what they have in common or what they can learn from each other, and look through one particular case study, including a sink, if you can imagine that, about how trade affects women with disabilities. So the key questions that I'm interested in, oops, sorry about that. Okay, this is where I can't always manage. The key questions I'm interested in is how does the Canadian gender and trade strategy deal with women with disabilities? And secondly, what indicators can be used to assess how trade policies address women with disabilities? And I'm going to spend more time on the second point because we need to think about what some of those indicators might be before we can actually do an analysis of how trade policy looks at the intersections of gender and disability. So, okay, so this is where I'm running into troubles. So the Canadian government has put significant attention in its trade negotiations to addressing gender equality and avoiding discrimination based in gender. It promotes what it calls a two-pronged strategy of creating standalone gender and trade chapters and mainstreaming gender-related provisions in its free trade agreements. The strategy has been part of how it's developed its trade agreements with Chile, Israel, Uruguay, New Zealand, the European Union, and the World Trade Organization. The approach also includes appointing a special advisor on gender-based analysis, trade and gender, and coordinating a gender and trade advisory group that Laura and I both sit on, and that I presented this first at, and that is why I'm here today. So the strategy builds on Canada's long-time commitment to gender-based analysis. While the Canadian International Development Agency had a women in development policy since the 1980s, the Canadian government adopted its gender-based analysis commitment in 1995. Since then, its implementation has been uneven. In 2006 and 2007, the Conservative federal government cut funding and offices, yet at the same time required government departments to undertake gender-based analysis in their funding submissions. In 2011, Canada introduced the plus to gender-based analysis, acknowledging that gender goes beyond sex and gender differences to include and consider multiple identity factors, including race, ethnicity, age, and disability. GBA Plus is meant to examine how diverse groups of women, men, and non-binary folks may experience policies, programs, and initiatives. Since the Liberal government came in 2015, they've recommitted and strengthened their gender-based analysis framework. It's now required for all memorandum of cabinet and Treasury Board submissions, but it also increased the bureaucratic capacity to address GBA Plus by adding funds to women and gender equality and making it a full department. As it's used in Canada, GBA Plus has been critiqued for its gender-first orientation and the fact that it prioritizes gender over other forms of oppression. The GBA Plus has been less successful in addressing structural or systemic barriers and power relations at work. With the bureaucratization of GBA Plus, critics have also argued that the government is focused on individual identity factors over structural and systemic equality barriers. And many critics have called for the incorporation of more intersectionality-based policy analysis methods, which could address these criticisms. So how does the Canadian strategy, gender and trade strategy, do in addressing diverse women, most notably women with disabilities? And what are the indicators, as I said? I'm only going to look at the indicators because I don't yet have a basis on which to assess how well it's done. I argued that there are at least two barriers to addressing the situations of women with disabilities in trade. A classification structure that relies on a medicalized approach to assistive devices and no analysis of the systemic and persistent barriers to trade in the context of the Accessible Canada Act and human rights commitments to accessibility and inclusion. So basically what I'm saying is there's a great attention to gender, but nothing on gender and accessibility and inclusion as far as I can see. So why should we look at women with disabilities in trade? Well, women with disabilities in Canada, and this is not dissimilar around the world, make up roughly 24% of the population. Indigenous women have higher rates of disability than non-Indigenous women. We also know that women with disabilities rely on both assistive devices and medication. Recent data suggests that most women with disabilities report using at least one aid or assistive device, and that increases the proportion of reliance, increases the greater the severity of the impairment or condition. 3/4 of women with disabilities report using prescription medications at least once a week. These indicators suggest that women with disabilities are significantly affected by trade decisions and policies that shape assistive devices and pharmaceuticals. But what we also know is that women with disabilities have much lower rates of employment than both women and men without disabilities. This is also linked to their much, much lower income levels, which are roughly half of what women and men without disabilities have. This leads to a high proportion of low income or poverty among women with disabilities, especially lone parents with disabilities. So with trade liberalization has also come a push to have a greater reliance on market forces, distributing resources, and that puts women with disabilities at a potentially greater risk. Since they have both lower incomes and are more reliant for income on government programs, they may have to allocate a significant portion of their income to assistive devices or health services or go without. So why women with disabilities and trade? Women with disabilities offer a unique and important vantage point on trade policies. As consumers, they rely heavily on assistive devices, health services, and pharmaceuticals. They experience greater risk from changes in prices, significant bureaucracy, access to goods and services because of their high reliance on government programs and low income. Finally, we know very little about their experiences as they've never been imagined in trade policies. One significant example of this is the World Trade Organization World Bank report on gender and trade, which does not discuss women and disabilities at all, even though it has a focus on workers, consumers, and decision makers. The study includes several implicit assumptions, including about who is vulnerable and what that means in a trade context, as well as how productivity shapes women's access to trade. And these two implicit assumptions structure out a discussion of women with disabilities. And I hope in a later version of my paper to talk more about that. So, oops, not quite there yet. So using a Canadian gender and trade policy to examine the impacts of trade on women with disabilities is an especially useful case study for two reasons. First, there's already this commitment to intersectional analysis through Gender-Based Analysis Plus. While we can challenge the depth of that commitment, it is there. Equally importantly, the government has adopted an Accessible Canada Act in 2019. For areas under federal jurisdiction, there is a legislative requirement to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to accessibility, including in procurement. As recent Canadian Statistics Canada data suggests, there continue to be significant barriers to accessibility in transportation, the built environment, information and communications technologies, and employment. Accessibility in each of these areas can be enhanced by the use of assistive devices and technologies. So using both a GBA Plus and accessibility lens on trade policy will help us to better understand and address the barriers that shape trade and women with disabilities. So as I said, this research has been long in gestation. It builds on a report that we did in 2004 for Status of Women Canada, the precursor to the current department, called Women with Disabilities Accessing Trade. We asked 3 questions, looked at 3 areas: trade and assistive devices and technologies, health services and products, and access to trade data. To do this, we undertook qualitative and quantitative research. We did focus groups and interviews with 42 women with disabilities, including 6 entrepreneurs, 11 women who identified as ethno-racialized women, 2 Indigenous women, and women with a range of disabilities: deaf, blind, low vision, hard of hearing, mental health disabilities, multiple disabilities, and invisible disabilities. Most of the data was collected in English, but one focus group was held in American Sign Language. The research team also did key informant interviews with vendors of assistive devices, program coordinators and brokers in Manitoba, Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Saskatchewan. We did an analysis of the related trade data and statistics. To complement this earlier research, I did a policy scan, and a co-op student, Michael Lenk, assisted by updating the trade data from 2002 to 2020. So in this paper, I focus on one key finding from the research: that access to assistive devices is directly linked to trade policies and demonstrated implicit and explicit systemic barriers that perpetuate ableism. That's a mouthful, isn't it? For Statistics Canada, assistive devices include personal aids and devices such as canes, walkers, other mobility devices, specialized software, as well as prescription medication. In trade data and under the harmonized system codes, only a few specific devices are included, all under medical technology. There is no separate classification for assistive technology, although there is a special classification called 9979.00.00 for goods which assist people with disabilities, and I quote, in alleviating the effects of those disabilities and articles and materials for use in such goods, end quote. Goods under this classification are imported into Canada duty-free. This is found in Chapter 99 of the Harmonized System, which is reserved for special classifications determined by individual countries. And here we get to the sink. So when you say you throw in everything but the kitchen sink, we're actually throwing in the bathroom sink in this analysis. So in 2011, Wolseley Canada Inc. took the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, to the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. They argued that a specific good, a sink, developed for use by people with disabilities should be duty-free under this tariff item 9979, since it was specifically designed for wheelchair users. Wolseley argued that the good was designed to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act and so worked to eliminate discrimination, and was also universally designed, which meant that it could be used by people with and without disabilities. They further argued that the sink was, quote, specifically designed for people with disabilities, and the fact that it could also be used by people without disabilities doesn't detract from its original intent and purpose. In contrast, the CBSA argued that since the sink was universally designed, it could not be specifically designed for people with disabilities. So they said exactly the opposite. Even though people with disabilities were clearly one of a number of populations considered in the sink's development. In 2013, the Trade Tribunal agreed with company Wolseley's argument and approved the classification of the sink. So following from that, the CBSA in 2015 issued a memo on goods to assist people with disabilities. It outlines 2 conditions that are required to meet the classification. The good must be specifically designed to assist people with disabilities and must assist in, quote, alleviating the effects of the disabilities. It says, care should be taken not to assume that just because a person with disability uses a particular good and benefits from the use of that particular good, that the 2 specifically designed conditions of the tariff item 9979 have been satisfied. To claim the benefits of this tariff item, importers must provide the name of the specific disabilities, a description of how the good alleviates the effects of this disability, and evidence that it was designed to alleviate the effects of disability. So to address assistive devices, Canada's approach is twofold. For those who wish to trade in devices already classified, and this is primarily medical technology, They access the technology in the same way as hospitals, institutions, and clinics that purchase medical technology. This has a dual effect of contributing to medicalizing disability and putting individuals with disabilities who must use and may need to import these in a more challenging position, because these processes have been set up for clinics and companies. For those who wish to use a device that has not been classified and claim it under 9979, they're required to prove the good of alleviating the effects of the disability and follow the whole rigmarole for that. Both approaches come from a medicalized understanding of disability and support a very complicated patchwork of disability supports in Canada. In many provinces, to receive assistive technology, medical professionals are required to act as gatekeepers, providing approval and signing forms, even when they have no expertise in the area. People with disabilities who are most knowledgeable about their own needs are prevented from obtaining their devices unless they're willing and able to incur the related expenses and navigate a very complicated system. In both approaches, disability is understood primarily to be in the body of the individual with the impairment or the condition. That's despite widespread understanding of the disabling nature of environments. Canada's trade policy in relation to assistive devices continues to use language that perpetuates the discourse of disability being about bodies in need of fixing, rather than about creating inclusive environments that can adapt to a variety of human beings with different ways of knowing and being. In the case of Tariff Item 9979, the onus to prove a good or device is assistive is on the importer. If they're not able to provide adequate evidence, duty is applied and the good costs more. The current approach increases requirements to justify and reduces the flexibility that is at the core of much of assistive technology. That is, different technology may have different functions depending on the user. At the heart of both approaches is ableism, a set of assumptions that create a world, including trade policies, for people without disabilities. The needs of people with disabilities are largely invisible, and when made evident, perceived as extraordinary and needing to be justified to be considered valid. So what does this mean? And what do I see as the next step, which are my final points? With the two Canadian frameworks of GBA Plus and the Accessible Canada Act, there's significant opportunity to explore how trade policy shaped and are shaped by women with disabilities. To do this, to date, this type of analysis has not been done. Our 2004 study suggests there's some important areas to consider, most specifically access to assistive devices. Data from the 2017 Canada Survey on Disability reinforces the importance of assistive devices and technologies in enhancing accessibility and addressing barriers. Recent policy changes by CBSA suggest that despite recognition, only after a tribunal ruling, of the need for some classification for assistive devices and technologies, the mechanisms to do this create more barriers to access for people with disabilities. Women with disabilities are more reliant than men on these devices because of their lower incomes and increased reliance on government supports, they have less capacity to pay extra money and make extra effort to get these devices. It's not surprising that 3 in 10 people with disabilities between 15 and 64 have an unmet need for an aid device or prescription medication due to cost. This increases for those with more severe impairments and for women. For women with disabilities living in poverty, 41% had unmet needs due to costs, compared to 33% for men with disabilities. So what can trade policy do to address these barriers? First,
Deborah, can you finish off?
Yep, we need more intersectional data. We need to do a gender-based analysis and accessibility lens analysis and ask a series of questions, which is, how do we address these barriers? What could be done within chapters of gender and trade? And finally, as researchers, we can widen our view to examine the diverse experiences of gender and trade, including women with disabilities. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Deborah. That was really fascinating. And we won't have questions now. We'll have questions at the end. So I will pass the baton over to Tequila Brooks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this really interesting and important panel. My paper is going to take a page from the paper that Laura will be delivering a little earlier and ask the question, can human and labor rights in preferential trade agreements entered into by the European Union be utilized to eliminate sexual harassment of female agricultural laborers in 4 different areas. These are the cut flower industry in Kenya, the strawberry sector in Morocco, and the strawberry sector in Spain, and in agriculture, particularly tomato greenhouses in Italy. The paper will have 3 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about grand legal commitments at the international level that govern violence against women and gender discrimination and sexual harassment at work. And these are CEDAW Recommendation 35, 2017 on gender violence. They are ILO Recommendation 190 entered into in 2019 on gender violence at work. And then I'll go into describing the case studies in each of these 4 countries. After describing the case studies, I'll examine European free trade agreements, as well as certain parts of EU law, to determine whether they can be utilized to assist female agricultural laborers to become free of sexual harassment and sexual violence at work. Finally, I'll look at the Cotonou Agreement of 2000, which expired last year and has been renegotiated and will be reframed as the Samoa Agreement, an agreement between the European Union and countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, a lot of their former colleagues, and to determine whether this instrument may be utilized to improve working conditions and equality for women in agriculture in Europe and Africa in this context. So a 2018 article in the United States in the Atlantic described sexual harassment in agriculture as an epidemic in the United States. In fact, this article is, it understates the problem. The problem is actually global. The problems of sexual harassment, rape in the field, and quid pro quo requests for sexual favors in exchange for jobs, transportation, and housing are endemic to agriculture throughout the world. Strawberries and tomatoes consumed by the Dutch and German are grown by women in Spain and Morocco and Italy. The flowers that are purchased at the supermarket in Manchester and Utrecht are picked and packed by women in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda, and elsewhere around the world. So the issues of discrimination in agriculture have been expanded by globalization in the form of export agriculture. In fact, you could say that the 16-year-old woman is the ideal employee, just as it was in export manufacturer. Agricultural employers find young women to have soft hands to handle the strawberries, and they follow rules and they don't cause problems. And so the question is, with women using free trade agreements like the NAFTA, the NALC, and the USMCA to advocate on their own behalf to improve their working conditions, how about in other parts of the world? This is a problem created in part by globalization. Can global tools be used to improve the issue? So the legal frameworks governing women's human rights and labor rights in agriculture. It was determined by CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of Women, in 2017, that the right to be free of gender violence is a right that is enshrined in international customary law. What that means is that when CEDAW issued its first recommendation on violence against women, countries started to try to improve their practices. They implemented policies and adopted laws to eliminate gender violence. And because of that practice, it's now part of customary international law. But despite legal and policy advances, since this was first adopted in 2002, gender violence is still a problem around the world. And there are multiple forms of gender violence. And CEDAW recommendation 35 specifically references gender violence at work. That includes sexual harassment, includes rape at work, and it includes quid pro quo requests for sexual favors in exchange for jobs and transportation. In 2019, the International Labor Organization adopted Convention 190 on eliminating gender violence at work. Under this, state parties are required to adopt laws to eliminate gender harassment and discrimination at work, and they're also required to implement these laws. Reporting and monitoring has not yet begun. Only 10 nations have signed the ILO Convention 190. Of the 4 countries examined in this paper, only Italy has signed the convention. It will enter into effect in October of this year. So now we go to the case studies. If you look at the research of UN Women and the ILO, the problem of sexual harassment in agriculture has been identified all over the world. In Italy, migrant workers originally came from North Africa, Tunisian men, and then later, as plans for expansion of the European Union got in their way, more workers from Romania and other post-communist countries in Eastern Europe started migrating to Europe to work in agriculture. More recently, Romania entered the EU in 2007, and a lot of women, spurred by poverty, started moving to Italy to work in agriculture. Because they're EU citizens, they bring their children. So they work on the fields, they live on the farms or in housing provided by employers, and they get to work in vehicles, transportation provided by the employers. Research has shown that sexual harassment is endemic and that employers use women's children as leverage to engage in sexual harassment. An example cited by research was of a mother whose employer demanded sex in exchange for getting her children to school every day because she was so isolated out in the countryside. The authors of this research has suggested that the EU instruments to utilize are actually EU directives on trafficking because the situation is so dire in Italy. In Spain, the case study focuses on the region of Andalusia, where strawberries have become the big export crop. Originally, the migrant workers utilized in the strawberry fields, in the greenhouses, and the packing sheds were from Romania and Poland. Poland entered the EU in 2004. Since these workers are EU citizens, they can settle in the area and form a population to draw agricultural labor. In addition, Spain has entered into agreements with Morocco to transport Moroccan women into Andalusia to pick strawberries. These are migrant workers, they have legal status, but if they complain about harassment, if they complain about anything, they can lose their status and be deported back to Morocco. some of the same issues, isolation, language problems, put these women at risk of sexual harassment and violence in the field. They're out in isolated areas. They live on the property of the farmers, and they are captive to this kind of behavior. And as Deborah mentioned, the power relations based on gender put these women at risk, physical risk and emotional risk for sexual harassment and violence. If you move to Morocco, in 2008, the Morocco Make Green Morocco Plan, GMP, introduced export agriculture as one of Morocco's economic strategies. So there are about 20,000 workers in Morocco producing strawberries for export for the European market. The research shows that the workers in the fields tend to be young, 15, 16. In order, they are transported up to 100 miles a day to work. And the employers provide transportation, or a series of labor contractors provide this transportation. So the women are packed onto buses or some kind of vehicle of like 55 women, and they're intermixed with men, and so they suffer harassment in the transportation of being touched and harassed by men. In addition, the labor contractors who provide these women's labor to the farmers demand sexual favors in order to get a job, in order to gain transport to work. The research shows that women who work in the packing sheds are recruited differently. They are recruited from the cities because they may be older, married, and have higher education in order to perform more advanced tasks in the packing houses in Morocco. In Kenya, Kenya is famous in feminist circles for the cut flower industry, and between 60 to 100,000 women and men who work in this, the majority of them women. Women have been migrating within Kenya to the Lake Naivasha area since the 1980s. And so now you have multiple generations of women working in the cut flower industry. One thing, just as in the strawberry and tomato sectors, women are chosen for their feminine qualities to cut and pack flowers. Men get the better jobs. They get to own the farms. They get to be the supervisors. Research shows that there are changes and that there are more women supervisors in the cut flower industry. The issue is the field workers, and these field workers are selected for temporary jobs that are contingent. They work for labor contractors, and just as described in Italy, Spain, and Morocco, there is sexual harassment in the granting of jobs. One researcher, Megan Lauthers, has a very interesting study where she discusses the sexual continuum of sex work in the Kenya cut flower industry. Women suffer demands for sexual favors in order to obtain and keep jobs. If they complain, they lose their jobs. So in order to supplement their low salaries, they engage in sex work in the Lake Naivasha community. It's become a tourist area with beautiful lakes. And so they work all day, they take care of their children and cook their meals. And then at night and on the weekends, they go out and engage sex work because they're learning so little in farm labor. And along this continuum, some women have just given up the farm labor. Their idea is, if I'm going to earn in 3 days as a sex worker what I earn in an entire week and have to give free sexual favors, why engage in agricultural labor? So it's a serious problem, and now it's multi-generational. So what can EU trade arrangements do for these women? Can they go out and file a petition, as women have done under the NAFTA labor side agreement or under the USMCA, as Laura's going to discuss. What are their options? This really depends on when the trade agreement was entered into by the EU. So with Morocco, well, let's start with Kenya. The EU entered into trade negotiations with Kenya and other East African nations in 1996. The agreement they entered into is called the EU EAC EPA, which is a preferential agreement, economic preferential agreement. Under this agreement has actually never been fully ratified by all the member states. Only the EU and Kenya have ratified it. Last year, it was decided, the countries got together and decided that individual members of the East African community can engage in trade with the EU and implement the agreement. So this agreement that's been on the books since 2000 will finally be initiated between the EU and Kenya in 2021. And they're working on establishing these trade agreements. Since the text is so old, it lacks a lot of the features of modern free trade agreements. Therefore, it has no labor provisions. It has no sustainable development chapter. And it doesn't have any kind of robust gender provisions. So as an instrument, it is not that helpful for facilitating improvement of the rights of female agricultural workers in Kenya. It does have provisions where the EU and Kenya can enter into dialogue, but I don't know how you would trigger that except by a massive campaign by women workers and their advocates. The negotiation process may also provide an opportunity for the EU to pressure Kenya to improve working women's rights. We'll see how that goes. So the EU-Morocco agreement was entered into in 2006. This agreement also is a old form agreement, so it lacks many of the hallmarks of some of these modern agreements, like the CETA between Canada and the EU, which has labor provisions and complaint mechanism. The EU-Morocco agreement has a chapter, Title VI, on social clauses. And a lot of this title focuses on equal rights of Moroccans working in the European Union and EU citizens working in Morocco. So those provisions might provide a tool to help not only women working in Morocco's strawberry sector, but also open up a forum for advocacy on behalf of Moroccan strawberry workers in Spain. So there are some possibilities there. In addition, the EU and Morocco, the EU has approached Morocco about modernizing its trade relations. I think modernizing the trade relations may include some of these more modern ideas of complaint mechanisms and robust gender and labor protections. So the EU-Morocco agreement is not really a great tool for helping women workers in Spain and Morocco. Finally, there's an agreement, a very old agreement that started with the Lomé Conventions as early as 1975 between the EU and the ACP countries. These are the countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The Cotonou Agreement actually has Article 50 on a social clause, and countries can actually trigger denial of benefits under this agreement by political dialogue. It has been used in regarding major human rights violations, and for example, coups in Zimbabwe, but so far has not been used on worker rights. The post-Cotonou agreement, which has been negotiated and is scheduled to be signed in Samoa later this year, may actually provide some real openings for improvement of women's rights and sponsorship of decent work in ACP countries, and more research required, maybe even the EU. So there's now a robust gender provision that specifically mentions sexual harassment. And there's also a provision, Article 33 in the post-Cotonou agreement to enter into effect later this year, which talks about improving labor rights and establishing structures for decent work. On the EU citizens from Romania working in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, it's really surprising that despite the robust structure, the regional agreements in the EU, they don't really have that much recourse. They're EU citizens, but when they encounter rape at work, they have a very difficult time complaining about it and getting perpetrators prosecuted. The EU actually, it has a directive, EU Equality Directive, first adopted in 2002 and revised in 2006. Sexual harassment is covered under this, and member states must adopt legislation to eliminate sexual harassment, but it does not cover quid pro quo harassment. So suffering demands for sexual favors in exchange for a job is not a requirement under the EU. In 2017, the EU Parliament issued a resolution calling on the EU Commission to make a proposal for a directive on gender violence that would cover gender violence at work, sexual harassment, and provide remedies for women. So hopefully in the future, with advocacy by women in Europe, there will be a directive on sexual violence and gender violence in the EU, but it's not there yet. So we have a lot of policies and possible mechanisms for the future, but right now the status is unclear, and there's not a real mechanism under EU trade that will help women eliminate sexual violence at work, especially women migrant farm workers. A closing note, the CETA, the EU, the free trade agreement between Canada and the EU does have a complaint mechanism. Theoretically, workers in Europe could file complaints with the Canadian HRSDC saying that their rights are not being protected. Romania and Italy have not ratified the CETA, but Spain has, and it's why I added it to my analysis. Theoretically, Moroccan workers in Spain could file a complaint with Canadian Labor Department about their treatment at work. Similarly, workers in Morocco could file complaints under the Canada-Morocco Free Trade Agreement or the US-Morocco Free Trade Agreement. That might get things moving. So I thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to Laura's presentation and to our discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Tequila. That was also really fascinating, and I also look forward to a discussion. So how do I become the presenter? I'm just going to try to share my screen. Just realized it's on the wrong page. Can you guys see that? Hi, can somebody tell me if they can see that? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to time myself. So thanks very much for being here, and it's really great to be presenting. Like Deborah, I really wish we were in Boston, but c'est la vie. So yes, so I am, as Tequila said, I'm going to focus on the case of labor rights in the well, in the North American context, really looking at the transition from discussions around labor rights and gender in the NAFTA towards the better inclusion of gender concerns in the new United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, sometimes in Canada referred to as CUSMA and in Mexico as TEMEC. And the paper itself draws upon literature on regionalism and regional integration in general. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but try to skip over that briefly. But indeed, North America was sort of the first region of the world to enter into a wave of new regionalism that was launched in the late 1980s, dominated by neoliberal philosophy, the interests of large multinational corporations, and the aspirations of, in this case, the regional hegemon, the United States. And debates over NAFTA sparked the emergence of a powerful anti-globalization movement and sort of modeled how diverse social movements, including trade unions, environmental movements, anti-poverty activists, faith-based activists, and women's organizations began to look together at some of the limitations of these neoliberal type free trade agreements. And some of the most trenchant critiques of globalization and regionalization have come from feminist activists and scholars around the world who have argued that the liberalization of trade, investment, and production relations has had a disproportionate impact on women, particularly racialized women and women in the global South. So these critiques emerged initially during the debate on NAFTA, especially in Canada, and but also led to the forging of ties amongst feminist movements in Canada, the US, and Mexico, which sadly, I would say, declined during the period of the NAFTA agreement. So there don't exist, I would say there's been a decline of national women's movements in the three countries, or especially in Canada in that period, and decline of trinational cooperation. So hopefully with the USMCA and the new mechanisms in that agreement, we'll see more of this element. So in the light of these events, this paper examines debates about the gendered impacts of regionalization and trade agreements. And I focus particularly on the use of labor rights provisions to advance the rights of women's workers. So the paper begins with a review of theories of regional integration that are drawn from the fields of international relations and international political economy. I'm essentially going to skip over that, but just to say that the older theories such as neo-functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism tended to be focused on the experience of Europe and assumed inevitable progress towards deeper levels of integration that did not play out in the same way in other parts of the world. So this new regionalism approach emerged in the late 1980s or so, and has been widely adopted around the world to look at diverse forms of regional integration. But I argue in the paper that all of these theories, whether the new regionalism approach or the older, more Eurocentric approaches, overlook the role of gender and the impact of regional agreements and neoliberalism on gender relations, despite the fact that what we saw very clearly, especially in the case of North America, is that regional integrations involved the feminization of the workforce, particularly in this case of the Mexican workforce. There was a shift towards older forms of away from older forms of industrial production in which male workers were dominant, towards increased employment of women workers for some of the reasons that Tequila was talking about, in these maquila factories that were, at least at the beginning, mostly located on the US-Mexico border. There are other gendered impacts of trade agreements, such as the rollback of service provision and others that I won't go into. So I also look at economic literature on gender and trade and feminist political economy approaches. So neoclassical approaches sorry, I've lost track of my notes. Neoclassical approaches tend to assume that trade is gender neutral. And in fact, some of this literature says that women are more likely to benefit from free trade agreements because they're more likely to be employed in sectors that are liberalized, and therefore they're going to get more jobs. And in fact, in the case of Canadian trade policy, if you look at some of the analyses of prospective trade agreements, they tend to, like the Mercosur agreement that's being negotiated, they tend to assume that women will do better because they're more inclined to be employed in service sectors, and therefore they're more likely, slightly more likely to get jobs in these agreements. So it's very type of analysis that is very lacking in power relations, looking at power relations, and also does not employ more intersectional analysis, such as the type that Deborah was talking about. So feminist political economists have developed strong critiques of this type of neoclassical economic approach, and look at diverse factors like these detailed here, the ways in which women are incorporated into the labor force under unequal conditions. Tequila has just been talking very concretely about some of the ways that happens. Lack of attention in this literature to women's role in the informal sector, which has ballooned under neoliberalism, especially in the global South, and also lack of attention to unpaid labor or care labor performed by women. A particularly important aspect in the case I'm looking at is the way in which labor unions, which might, in the best of all possible cases, might work to increase the wages of women and improve labor conditions, at least in many cases, and especially in Mexico, those labor unions have been dominated by men and have been undemocratic. They've been incorporated into the Mexican corporatist system, and they do not work to advance workers' interests in general, or especially women's interests. So, however, there have been increased attentions at the international level, as our papers have indicated, to the way in which trade and gender are interact. And that's led to a wave, and just over the last few years, of attempts to address the gender dimensions of trade. And that is exemplified perhaps most vividly by this WTO declaration in the Buenos Aires ministerial meeting in 2017, which is now, this declaration is now signed by over 120 countries, despite the fact that the WTO was very weak in terms of gender analysis for most of the years of its existence. It's now proselytizing the idea that trade agreements need to incorporate a gender perspective into the promotion of inclusive economic growth. And I see in that term inclusive, that very much reflects the Canadian approach to try to think about trade, to say that we need to have free trade agreements, we need to promote liberalized trade, but we need to make the benefits more inclusive. And indeed, I think Canada was one of the important actors here, and we see our former trade minister Champagne is the man grabbing the piece of the paper that has the declaration on it in the front row there, trying to claim some credit for this declaration. However, there's been a strong critique of that declaration coming from women's organizations, particularly in the global South. And this is a picture here of a demonstration that was held in the streets of Buenos Aires. And there was a counter declaration or a statement put together by feminist organizations, especially from the global South, critiquing the content of this declaration and the narrow approach it takes to assessing the gendered impacts of trade. So they say, basically the critique is that the WTO declaration and the types of policies adopted by governments like Canada are mostly directed to the interests of the wealthiest women, the most privileged women, especially women-owned businesses, and the barriers they may encounter, which is not, not that that shouldn't be considered, but it doesn't assess the impact of these trade agreements on more marginalized women, and they call it a pink herring that is being used to assert the benefits of liberalized trade without looking at all of the harms that those agreements might take. So in the rest of the paper, I look at the case of North America briefly. Oops. So indeed, there were gender considerations raised by women's organizations in the struggle around the North American Free Trade Agreement, which took place in the late 1980s. And there was an argument made at that time that the agreement was gender blind. There were no specific gender related provisions. There was a labor side accord, which did mention discrimination against women workers, but it had no real teeth because it was a side accord and not a chapter in the agreement. And it was very difficult to use that chapter to promote women workers' interests. And indeed, as I mentioned, there was a rapid growth of women's employment in Mexico in particular, in the maquila sector. And these were jobs that were very poorly paid, very weakly protected, very poor labor conditions. And indeed, there's been a backlash against NAFTA, partly because men were losing their jobs in blue-collar employment, better paid, better protected employment in the US and Canada. That backlash is somewhat responsible for the Trump phenomenon and continued protectionism in the United States today. So the graph on the right shows the levels of female employment in the maquila sector, which is still very high. That's shown in purple compared to the number of men. And so the level of female employment in the maquilas has declined over time, but is still extremely high compared to other industrial sectors in Mexico. So in response to this situation, the Canadian government has been adopting an approach that tries to integrate gender-based analysis, as Deborah was discussing, and this slide basically summarizes what Deborah was saying about the two-pronged approach of the Canadian government. Canada, under the Trudeau government, has adopted this GBA approach across government departments, or GBA plus approach across government departments. It has also adopted a feminist foreign international assistance policy, the FIAP, and has also committed itself to a feminist foreign policy, and is trying to integrate gender concerns into new, these more modernized trade agreements. So that they're doing that both through trying to get standalone chapters on gender and trade, an approach that has been fairly criticized, quite a lot criticized by feminists as, just laying out some nice ideas about sharing ideas across the member parties about how to improve the gender impact of trade agreements. So that's one approach, and we have seen that come out in the Canadian free trade agreement with Chile and also with Israel, and they're trying to promote these standalone chapters in other new agreements. And also more recently, they've been focusing on trying to mainstream gender across other provisions or other chapters of trade agreements, which I think is probably more promising approach, and that does include labor chapters. So what happened with the USMCA? We had, this feminist government in Canada come into the agreements, the negotiation of the USMCA, facing major challenges in terms of the attitudes of the Trump administration. So Chrystia Freeland, who was then our trade minister, who is a strong feminist, said when we entered into the negotiations that she would demand both gender and Indigenous chapters to be included in the agreement. And that quickly ran into problems in the face of resolute opposition from the United States, which just refused to talk about such a possibility. And interestingly, more recently, the Mexican government has committed itself to a feminist foreign policy approach. So the current government, not the one represented during the USMCA negotiation process, but the current government of López Obrador has committed itself to a more feminist approach, and it has shown itself, fairly open to these proposals coming from Canada, and perhaps the Biden administration might be considered more open as well. So what happened though with the USMCA negotiations? So the US refused to consider this gender chapter, but the USTR in the US, the Trade Representative's Office did accept some provisions related to gender in the labor chapter, and the Trump administration did promote the idea of a labor chapter in the new agreement. So I will show that here. So this is the text that eventually came out in Article 23.9 of the USMCA. So the original text became rather controversial because it referred in this GBA approach to issues related to employment discrimination on the basis of sex, including pregnancy, sexual harassment, sexual orientation, gender identity, and caregiving responsibilities. And the inclusion of that language around sexual orientation and gender identity, which is part of the Canadian government's understanding of gender and GBA plus analysis, was strongly opposed by Republicans in Congress, and as a result had to be watered down. So a letter was sent by 40 lawmakers that states the trade agreement is no place for the adoption of social policy, it's insulting to our sovereignty, and so forth. So as a result, the USTR pushed for revised language, which you see on the right, which is considerably weaker, and also insisted on the inclusion of a footnote that said basically that the US was not, required to do anything under this article because their policies were so great already. So this, courageous attempt to include considerations around gender identity and sexual orientation were also quashed, sadly. So where does that leave us? That does leave us with a labor chapter that is quite strong and progressive, and does include quite good measures around gender, if not around so much around gender identity. And interestingly, the first complaint that was brought forward under the new USMCA labor chapter was brought forward by Mexican female migrant workers. That was the petition was developed by the binational Centro de Derechos de los Migrantes, which has a long history of working for the rights of migrant workers, Mexican migrant workers in the United States. And it addresses those types of concerns around sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace, in the agricultural sector that Tequila has been discussing. So this was the first case that was brought forward, which was completely unexpected, I would say, by most labor rights activists who might have expected a more traditional case directed at, sorry, I've got to stop, at labor rights violations in Mexico. So this was a quite bold move, and the promoters of this case, the CDM, were quite happy when the Mexican and US governments accepted accepted some of these concerns, and this has resulted in a dialogue between the US and Mexican government around addressing these concerns. Also, just to conclude, and this is where my research is going to go next, there has also been new funding provided by both the US and Canadian governments to support labor rights in Mexico. And those projects are included here. So that 20 million is going from the US Labor Department around to promote democratization of labor rights in Mexico, and almost 10 million from Canada. And I'm actually on the International Advisory Board of the UNIFOR project, which is establishing worker action centers to promote knowledge of labor rights in Mexico, especially focusing on the auto manufacturing sector. And there's another project there. So there's quite a significant amount of money going into promoting labor rights. And what I want to look at is whether these projects are going to incorporate gender considerations in any meaningful way. The requirements for the grants did require that the NGOs and labor unions that were applying for the funding did show some gender-based analysis, but it is possible that when the rubber hits the road, that once these projects are rolled out, that traditional tendencies towards male domination of the labor sector in Mexico may prevail. So that's it. So this paper promotes the idea of the need for gender sensitive, analytical, and theoretical tools for studying regionalism and the usefulness of looking at the labor sector to go beyond the tendency to promote gender-based analysis that overlooks the position of more marginalized groups of women, and to promote, to use labor chapters to promote women workers' rights, and including migrant workers' rights. So I will stop sharing. And so thanks to everybody. I think I went slightly over my time, sorry. And I guess what we could do now is see if anyone in the audience has any questions. And so you can either, I believe, use the raise hand function or type into the chat if you want to do that. Oh, there is some chat. So does anyone have any questions? Not seeing any right away. I do have a couple of comments that I can make on the other papers, if you think that's a good idea, Deborah.
Yeah, and I actually have a question for both of you, so it's up to you.
Okay.
If you want to.
Okay, you go ahead, Deborah, and then I'll raise my questions, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that I've often wondered, I know in the Canadian approach to gender, it's not necessarily a binary approach to gender, but to what extent is in the areas that you've been considering gender really understood as men, women, male, female, rather than a more non-binary approach to gender?
Right, great. Actually, that was one of my questions or comments. Sorry, I wrote down, we had a discussant, but sadly she wasn't able to join us, and I didn't get to read the papers ahead of time, but I did write down some questions. Yeah, so in terms of that, Deborah, I wanted to comment that I've written another paper that looks at the use of indicators for evaluating trade measures, and commenting on the limitations of those approaches. So essentially, if you look at how the Canadian government is implementing its GBA plus approach, they say they do consultation with affected groups, including women's groups, also Indigenous groups. But both Deborah and I are part of this consultation group, and I would say the level of consultation is pretty shallow. So it's just a bunch of people, including women from women-owned businesses and a few academics, more critical academics. And we're in this big, Teams meeting, and, basically there's zero discussion or real engagement. So I would say that aspect of it is very shallow. Although, and it's stronger, the consultation that's happening under the Trudeau government is stronger with labor unions. It's been much, much stronger. And with Indigenous groups, I would say it's been quite significant, but with women's groups, it's been very weak. And then they use quantitative, computable general equilibrium model, CGE models, which are the standard devices that are used to evaluate trade agreements. And when they go about doing that, they use a very binary approach to gender. So there's, women and men, and there's no other category. It's one or the other, right? And I think they recognize that that's a weakness, but they don't have any idea about how to go about changing it. And indeed, it's doubtful to me that you can use a CGE model to include other dimensions of intersectionality other than a binary gender approach. They try to include women-owned businesses in that, and Indigenous, but the number of Indigenous is so small, it doesn't show up very well. So basically they come up with models that say, that, like I said, that women will benefit because there's more women working in the services sector. And they only look at the impact on Canadian women and not on women or gender diverse people in the trading partners. So they're not going to look at the role of women in the agricultural sector in Mexico, for example, which is appalling. So I think there's real limitations to the types of indicators that they're using. And I would be interested in your thoughts, Deborah, on what would be an alternative approach to developing indicators. And one thing that I think is really great in what you're doing is looking at the consumption side, which is also overlooked. So it looks at, so you're looking at women as consumers, or disabled women specifically as consumers, and how they're affected by trade agreements. And that's completely overlooked in this analysis, although, often it will sort of be stated that women will benefit from trade agreements because they'll be able to buy cheaper goods. Basically, that's the argument, which may have some merit. So that was one of my questions, but yeah, I agree with you that there's real limitations in terms of the binary, and I think that came out in the negotiation of the USMCA when Republicans in Congress refused to countenance more progressive language, more inclusive language around gender orientation and gender identity.
Yeah.
So Tequila, do you want to answer that question? But I have a question for you too.
I guess my research is fairly binary, but some of the studies I looked at, they don't really discuss other forms of gender among the migrant farm workers. So a question is, how many are LGBTQ? And how does this affect them in particular? I think there might be an opening for academic researchers to conduct more analysis along those lines. And then as far as disabled women and disability, agriculture is one of the most dangerous industries in the world. In the US, it's like third as far as worker deaths and injuries, being out in the hot sun, having your kidneys fail, not having access to water. And what's interesting about these studies of sexual harassment is considered occupational safety and health issue, but there are other issues. And there's research on Canadian, like Mexican workers in Canada, as far as the injuries they suffer and how that impacts their recruitment. But the studies I looked at were silent on the issue, but I'm sure that in addition to the health issues related to sexual violence, in fact, the increase of abortions by migrant female farm workers in Sicily, and the unwed mothers in Kenya, there are other health issues that aren't even being addressed. And the original NAFTA labor side agreement included occupational safety and health, and Canada's labor side agreements to trade agreements talk about occupational safety and health and access to compensation for worker injuries. In the US models, that's not really addressed. It's kind of been left by the wayside in the favor of the core labor standards. And one of the studies I looked at commented that the ILO declaration, the core labor rights, are actually, well, directly, they are not the labor rights that cost money. Organizing a union may eventually cost money, but they're not talking about improvements to factories for occupational safety and health. And I thought that was a very interesting point.
Great, thanks, Tequila.
Tequila, I think that's a really important point to look at the relationship between industries which disable, because it isn't just occupational. I mean, that's the container we call it, but it's actually the creation of disability by these industries and the responsibility for both tracking, but also addressing the disabling. So the violence, there's some really interesting work being done in Canada around the links between gender-based violence and traumatic brain injuries.
Oh, wow.
And how, you know, when you begin to understand that GBV, gender-based violence, can result in traumatic brain injuries, you begin to see that disabled women are those who often receive violence, but they end up becoming disabled because of the violence.
Wow.
So I think the picture is really complex. And when we begin to think about some of these things, we need to pull in more of our intersectional analytic threads in order to understand what's really going on.
That's really fascinating. What I noticed looking at the European model is they didn't start out with a parliament, but now they have a parliament. And the European Parliament and all the women in the European Parliament have been fighting for new policy measures, and they've been demanding research. And I think some of these, I mean, they could demand a research on disabilities among female farm workers in Europe and amongst their trade partners, because people said, oh, there's not enough research. And I said, there's a ton of stuff. I found all these articles, but really something very comprehensive that addresses these issues, that's not being done. There are different academics in their silos writing these reports and analyses, but nothing comprehensive. And this injuries, that is super fascinating.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of literature in Canada about the health implications of migrant worker programs. So people like Jenna Hennebree, and there's another woman who's worked on that. And I think in the context of the pandemic, there's been sort of really much more consciousness of the health impact of migrant workers and especially the living conditions, which has been stressed a lot by migrant workers organizations in Canada, which is also a gender issue, because one of the arguments against employing women has been that if you did so, you'd have to have more housing. You'd have to have housing for women and housing for men, whereas now they're just sort of cramming all the men into tiny little spaces, which is an environment that really has led to high rates of COVID transmission and even death amongst migrant workers. A question I had for you, Tequila, is around employment of women workers. I found that really fascinating about what you're saying about the predisposition to hire women workers in certain sectors, because in Canada and well, in North America in general, part of, as you know, the complaints that were brought forward under the NAFTA labor side accord related to gender were about the low rate of employment of women workers as migrant workers in agriculture in Canada and the US. And there was a complaint brought forward, but it wasn't really dealt with. It was towards the end of the NAFTA. So in agriculture in Canada and the US, they only bring in about 3% of the workers brought in from Mexico are women, which is a very low rate. And previously, employers were allowed to specify that they wanted women workers or male workers, and they almost always specified male. Except I think that 3% of women workers tended to go into the strawberry production industry in Quebec, particularly. So there were like some farms that would specify women workers for the types of reasons you said, but by and large, the employers wanted men and they got men. They were allowed to specify men. And so, and because workers get renewed, if once they've been in the country once, then they can be renewed year after year after year. There's a tendency, even now, employers aren't allowed to specify that they want men. They still get men because those are the workers that have already been coming. So it's very difficult, even though the governments have tried to change that situation, it hasn't really happened. So I'm just really interested in why the cases you're looking at, why there seems to be more of a preference for women workers. And do you have specific statistics about the percent of the migrant labor force that's female?
I only looked at these these particular case studies, and so they seem to be isolated to particular regions. But I'd like to look more at what the percentages are. Like in Morocco, the strawberry sector, the statistic I saw was that 75 to 90% of the people employed are women.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and same in Spain. But the I haven't done like a thorough analysis of the and in Italy it's kind of unclear what sectors they actually work in the agricultural sub-economies. But yeah, it's fascinating. They choose the workers based on their gender characteristics.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned the issue of trafficking, and I think that is an area where the United States Labor Department is investing a lot of energy and interest now around looking at issues of trafficking, because most migrants are brought in by contractors and not just sort of arriving on the doorsteps of the farms, or they're not able to do so. And migrant rights organizations often identify labor contractors as the ones that are perpetuating many of the forms of labor rights violations. So they're charging potential migrants to be able to come as workers to Europe or Canada, the US. So can you say something more about the role of labor contractors and what role they might play in this situation?
Yeah, what I find funny is I worked as a farm labor advocate during law school, and contractors are the means by which farm labor is kept informal, not only in the United States, but everywhere. It is the primary mechanism for employing agricultural laborers. In the United States, we have a law. It originally started as the Farm Labor Contracting Act, and then it was changed to the Migrant Seasonal Agricultural Labor Protection Act. But the focus of that act is to provide some kind of right of action against the labor contractors, because what happens is the farmers save money by contracting out to labor contractors. So they just say, you find me the workers. They say it's because they don't speak the language, but really it's a way of protecting them from lawsuits by farmers and for responsibility for the actions of the farm labor contractors. And as in any trilateral relationship, the farm labor contractors, they get a certain amount of money, and they take their cut before they pay the workers. And that's why the workers are so poorly paid. And they are also completely, they aren't accountable. In litigation, farm worker litigation in the United States, farm labor contractors, they may be prohibited, and so they just get their cousin to take over the business, and they still engage in the same practices. So I think the Migrant Worker Protection Act is actually a good model that should be looked at around the world. because they are actually the perpetrators of a lot of these crimes. And it's global. It is so bizarre. Every study, research, news report you read, it's the same mechanism. And maybe something international should be done, because they are the means by which these rights abuses occur. And maybe if you cut out these middlemen and find a better way of contracting farm labor, that would improve farm workers' lives.
Right. But it's very difficult to find a way to cut out the middle people. So that there is a way of doing that, which is the model that Canada used for bringing in seasonal agricultural workers. It makes the government the middle person that contracts labor. So the Mexican government Ministry of Labor actually contracts the labor. So they do have some capacity to influence the type of labor that is brought in. But they still, even though they realize they should be allowing more women to be employed, they still have little capacity to actually influence the situation. So yeah, we did an analysis comparing contraction of labor in Mexico and in Guatemala. And in Guatemala, where you don't have the government as involved as one of the actors in the process, that there's much more abuse of the situation of providing visas to workers, because the workers are much more vulnerable than in Mexico, where the government does at least play a role in choosing the workers who are going to come into the system. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to go, but it's very difficult to achieve that situation. Deborah, did you have any thoughts about better types of indicators that could be used to assess issues related to disability in trade and the impact of trade agreements?
Yeah, I think a piece of for disability, a piece of it is beginning an analysis of where the impacts are. So I think the first part is, if we use the categories sort of employment or workers and consumers, what is it, how, I mean, if we look, how do trade agreements change the situation? Because the employment of people with disabilities, and especially women with disabilities, is already so much worse than women in general. So do trade agreements actually provide any incentive? The critique is that it increases service sector work and potentially part-time work. Well, that's already where women with disabilities are.
Yeah.
To me, one of the indicators would be, to what extent do labor chapters ensure workplace accommodation? So there's no discussion of that as far as I know. There's some in the occupational health and safety, but that's not the same as workplace accommodation. So if we were even understanding the extent to which there was a requirement to ensure workplace accommodation, we might be able to figure out if that's the barrier that's keeping, because that's been the argument in Canada, that's the lack of an inclusive workplace is what's keeping women and men with disabilities out of the workforce.
And are there ILO conventions that can be referred?
There is a ILO convention. I don't have the number in my head right now, but there was also just a recently, I can follow up with that, but there are a couple of them in particular. There's an old one and then a new one. That are in relation to workers with disabilities. Right. So that's one indicator. I think on the consumer side, I think a piece of this is about, how do you get the supports necessary to live life through trade? And that's why I focused on assistive devices, because that's been clearly identified as an area where trade is having an impact. I think a second area, and that we talked about in our original study, is pharmaceuticals.
Right.
and the cost of health services.
Right.
The impacts of privatization of health services is significant. The additional costs or the reduced costs of pharmaceuticals will be an indicator. But again, it's because of the level of use as consumers rather than just because they're disabled, right? It's because. And so then the last one is about decision makers. If you think about the World Trade Organization sort of set of categories. And it's clear that women with disabilities have very little information about trade. They don't get why this has an impact in their life. And that's, and that's partly because they've never been imagined in it, partly because we don't talk about trade in anything but really abstract terms. And so they don't identify themselves as workers necessarily or as consumers in the way that the trade agreements do. So it's about figuring out why these are important and making the case. So I actually think advocacy organizations haven't done a very, human rights advocacy organizations have done a really poor job on addressing disability. And I include the labor unions on that. I mean, in Canada, they're pretty good, but transnationally, I don't find there's been the same sort of piece. So are we including disability justice in our call for migrant rights, right? Like if we don't understand that they're integrally related when we talk about gender-based violence and the creation of disability, the perpetuation of disability, it's not going to be part of our discourse. So it's in part recognizing that it is already a part of it. We're making it invisible.
Right. Yeah, so there has been this consultation around feminist foreign policy in Canada. And, I think that is a promising direction as well that could incorporate better disability rights organizations. That one organization is at Dawn.
Disabled Women's Network.
Yeah,
right.
In Canada.
But they get asked to everything. They're so overstretched.
Yeah.
And
all the organizations, especially women's organizations, they're so overstretched and they've been hit so hard by decades of neoliberal policies that they don't have the time or the energy or the resources to involve themselves. Whereas the women-owned business sector, they might not be doing as well as men-owned businesses, but at least they have some resources to involve themselves.
And it's about, I'm working with Indigenous women's organizations right now around disability, and it's about how do we think about the similarities and the ways in which we can see justice in a more complicated way. And so I think part of the tension for disabled women's movements is A, there are so few of them around the world, and B, those that have to work in the disability sector to bring gender forward, in the women's sector to bring disabilities forward, and then respond to every single policy area that's around. And they never got the funding that women's groups had. So they're not even starting from level ground with women's groups that have been around, right? So
I think part of the problem is it's incumbent on governments and regional organizations to provide funding to make consultation processes more accessible and more open to groups with less resources, right? So, I think that's an interesting direction to be looking at in the current global context. There are consultation processes around feminist foreign policy to make sure they include trade, because trade policy tends to get left out of the discussion of feminist foreign policy. And then to make sure that there are diverse groups involved in that consultation process, including migrant rights organizations that have been, I would say, completely absent from that discussion. And I think Europe, is moving more in the direction, the EU is moving more in the direction of including or talking about feminist foreign policy, and Germany as well, and possibly the US, and Mexico has a new feminist foreign policy, which is very weak right now. And, you know, it's like laughably weak right now, but there might be some openness to consider this kind of, to use that as an opening for pushing some of these issues.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Deborah and Laura, about your participation in the foreign feminist foreign policy group.
No, it's the.
I've never been invited to that one.
Oh, okay. I thought you were both on it.
No, it's the Gender and Trade Advisory Group that we're both on.
The Gender and Trade Advisory Group. It seems as though the COVID era has taught businesses more about transport and trade in medical devices and medicines. Is there any way to ensure some kind of genuine dialogue between the business women in the group and the academics and labor side people, so that you can have genuine conversations about these things? Because the ILO recommendation 190 came out as a cross class. You know, you had women in business as well as working women who were working together. It seems like women are a good group for this kind of cross class communication. Is there a way to improve that in this group, in the gender policy group?
Sure, I have been there less long than Laura, but my experience is by presenting this research that I presented to you today, it sort of stopped people. There was oh my goodness, there's a whole different way of thinking about this. And there's been so much follow-up with me, not necessarily by government, but by contractors. Right, like I've been approached to do a series of supports to help people think through the gender and inclusion aspects of particular pieces of work. So in that way, it's been good. I think that it hasn't necessarily shifted the gender and trade conversation, but I sit on a parallel disability inclusion advisory group for global affairs. And that was created very recently and is intended, and it's a very novel thing for global affairs to be doing this. And it's helping global affairs to think through how to address disability generally in their practices. So in their development assistance practices, and I bring up trade as a piece of this in, you know, they're thinking about feminist foreign policy. And we have an opportune moment in the people that are involved in that piece right now, because they're at the beginning of their 2-year cycle and they already get why this is important. So we've got 2 years with them to get this moving. So it seems to me the opportunities are growing. I'm not going to overstate what the possibilities are, but I think there is, from my perspective, greater awareness of an intersectional approach now than there ever has been at global affairs.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's night and day, I would say, like just astonishing in a way to see the changes that have happened over the last 3 years, I would say. Yeah. And this GTAG, the Gender and Trade Advisory Group, is really new too. It's just like last year it started. So, and it was during the pandemic. So we're not meeting in person. So the form of consultation, I would say it's very much consultation in quotation marks, because it's just like people presenting and boxes of on the screen of people are there, you know, without their faces showing. It's a bit of like teaching a large group of undergraduate students who aren't engaged. So there isn't really, it's very difficult to build dialogue across, you know, business, and there is no labor, actually no labor involvement in that group. Nobody from the labor sector is participating. I don't know if it's because they haven't been invited.
I thought Oxfam, well, I know Oxfam.
Well, they're not labor. No,
right.
None of the labor unions are there, even though I would say labor is the strongest sector now in Canada in terms of considering gender gender and trade issues in terms of, well, because all the other sectors are so weak now. But yeah, no, I don't know if they've not been invited or they haven't, explored that option. So that's disappointing. So, but, it's so new that, I think it is a good model that at least they've taken this on. But there is a feminist foreign policy civil society working group that I was asked to participate in it, that carried out consultations around feminist foreign policy, which did have a trade dimension. Like there was one workshop on trade, and Bonnie, is it, from Dawn, did participate on raising disability issues, which was great. And it was much more participatory process. And the government is currently apparently drafting, or has drafted, a policy, but hasn't released it yet based on that consultation. So we'll see if it comes out. We had an election, so it got postponed, but it may be coming out soon. So it'll be interesting to see how they take on issues of intersectionality and other tough issues that are being raised by civil society actors. Yeah, so I think, overall Canada is doing a pretty good job, especially, compared to, there aren't that many other countries that are trying to do feminist foreign policy, and trade often is left aside, as I said, and it's more of a focus on security issues, I would say, and human rights. But, so I think, we're kind of new. This is all kind of new. And it'd be good to look at actually experiences in the global South, like Chile, which has a new progressive president, and maybe come back to this issue of trade and gender in an interesting way. That'll be interesting to follow, because they do have gender chapters in their trade agreements, and they pioneered that actually under Bachelet. But yeah, I'd be interested in other. I think it's great you're looking at these cases in Africa, Tequila, because I knew nothing about this. So that's really, really interesting. So I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time. Are there any questions that anybody in the audience wanted to raise? I guess not. So unless anybody else, Deborah or Tequila, did you want to say anything else?
I'm good. It's been a pleasure.
That's
what I can say. It's been really interesting. A good way to spend a Saturday morning.
Yeah, for sure. What else are we going to be doing? It's
a pandemic
in Ottawa. I'm not going to be out doing anything more fun than this. It has been a pleasure to talk to you guys. I'm sorry Erin and Alma couldn't participate. Maybe we can find another forum to bring this discussion around again another time, hopefully in person in some interesting part of the world. So thanks very much to you guys for participating, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Deborah.
Nice to meet you all.